Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Indovina, and thanks for hanging out today. Today, my guest is Mike Marsh, and if you're not familiar with Mike, Mike is a mastering engineer based out of London. He has done a ton of work. He's been a mastering engineer for over 30 years. He's worked with artists such as U2, The Prodigy, Etta James, Oasis, Bob Marley, NWA, so many different artists in different genres of music. So he brings a really cool perspective to our talk today because he's worked on some of the biggest records in so many different styles. And one of the big things that we talk a lot about in this episode today is the idea of referencing other songs, whether you're referencing them to get a sense of a frequency curve that you're looking for with a specific genre, or whether you're referencing previous mixes or previous masters to help you get consistency in your sound or to help you with translation. Reference tracks are really helpful, but so many people don't use them. I think a lot of people have heard of the idea of it, and I think to some degree, some people will listen to music after they've mixed something to compare their music to, but there's ways that you can use reference tracks during the entire process. And if you're constantly checking in with your references, it allows you to get results quicker and easier and with more confidence. And so we kind of touch on some of that in this interview today. And we've certainly talked about reference tracks before on the podcast, but I don't think that I've had a mastering engineer really talking about how they use references in their process. So I think this is really refreshing. And even if you're not a mastering engineer, I think there's still a lot of information that you can take from this and implement it into your own process. Whether you're recording or editing or mixing, you can use these references in so many different ways. And there are some really important factors that go into choosing the right references, which we obviously get into in today's episode as well. So yeah, we certainly talk about references. We also get into Mike's process when it comes to mastering for singles versus albums versus making albums after you've mastered a whole bunch of individual singles, which is a whole other process. So we get into that, his experience with vinyl cutting, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Again, like I said, Mike has a ton of experience, so he brings a lot of really interesting topics to the table here today. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. Mike Marsh, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. How's it going today?
Yeah, really good, thanks. At the end of Christmas, I'm chilled, so I'm in the zone for having a good podcast with you.
Love it, man. Thank you so much. For people who might not be familiar with you and who you are, what you do, and some of the projects you've worked on, can you give us that background on all that good stuff and how you got into it?
Oh, gosh, it's going to be a long story. So I'm a mastering engineer in the UK, always have been. But initially, I started off as a recording engineer. I was at school getting disillusioned with any more education whatsoever. 17 years old, I'd had enough. And I really wanted to get into television. So I wanted to be a TV cameraman. But back in the day, in the UK, we only had 3 TV channels here. So to try and get a job there was like not going to happen. So anyway, walking around the school one day, the jobs notice board, which was always full of crappy jobs like working in a bank or boring things, happened to have a flyer on it saying recording studio opening locally, trainee engineer wanted. And like my eyes perked up and I thought, that's something I want to do. I was well into music by then. I've been sort of playing music and messing about with it since about 10 years old, I guess. So to work in music sounded cool, and it was something I was really passionate about and wanted to get into. And I got the job. So I went along for the interview, got the job. It was a multi-track, 16-track, 1-inch tape machine studio. And I basically had to learn on the job. There's no instruction manual, and you basically you make it up as you go along, like most of us guys do, and you learn so much by doing that, and you make so many mistakes, and you slowly start getting things right. So I was literally thrown in at the deep end, recording with young bands that wanted to make a sort of 3-track demo, which most of the time ended up on cassette back then, so they could get gigs. Long story short, from that recording studio period, when I was there for 2.5 years, the guy who owned it, his brother ran Island Records disc cutting studio in London, which was called the Sound Clinic. His name was John Dent, very well known and respected engineer, sadly no longer with us. His brother, John in London, said, hey, can we borrow Mike for a couple of weeks? We're building a new studio. Basically, they were leaving Island Records because at that point, the record company didn't want to invest in a big step forward, if you like, with the way mastering engineer equipment was going. So the guys that were there, John Dent and his partner, Graham Durham, set up the exchange, left Island Records and basically borrowed me to help install all the gear, do loads of soldering, get it all working, get it up and running. And I was only there at that point for like a very short period just to get them to get on the air, and they had bookings in the diary. So we had to get it done. And basically 2 to 3 weeks of me with the soldering iron waggling about, sessions were starting. And I looked at mastering and I thought, geez, this is so much way better than recording. There's no arguments. There's no band fights. There's no, and you're like driving the session as well, because as a mastering engineer, it's quite a solitary job. But in a way, that's a good thing because you're getting stuff done. You're not waiting for people to pull their finger out and stop fighting. So I really like that side of it, and just the kind of full on creativity of doing what you need to do when you're mastering. So anyway, we built the studios. We got 3 studios up and running, and they said to me, well, thanks for all your help, Mike. You may as well go back to Devon, which is where I hail from. That's where the recording studio was. And I said to them, I don't want to go back to Devon. Is there any chance of a job here? And they said, they looked at each other and there's a job here if you want one. And I think I was 19 at the time, still living at home with the parents, They said to me, there's a job here for you if you want one. So I drove all the way home that night going, do I make the big jump? And I did. And basically within about a week, I was back there. So, and what was supposed to be 2 to 3 weeks of work has now turned into nearly 30 years in the same place. So
that's amazing.
Yeah. And that, that's the truth. I guess it's the luck of life a little bit. A door opens for you. You can either go through it and take it and grasp it, or you can walk away. And I just knew I had to do it because, as I said, for me, mastering held so much more than being a recording engineer anymore. I had enough of the fights and the arguments. So, yeah. So I jumped into mastering, and I've been doing that since 1987.
I love that. Well, I think that there's an important detail in what you said there that hopefully people caught, was that you took your shot. You asked for the gig. If they were sending you home and you're like, I want this, like, make it known. I think that's like, some people are a little too passive about it, and like they're like, oh, like someone will find me when it's time, but like I think there's something to be said for like shooting that shot.
Yeah, for sure. I was a cheeky teenager and respectful at the same time, but basically if you don't ask, you don't get. So I had nothing to lose. If they said, nah, sorry, there's no job here, it's like, oh, okay, I'll just go back to the studio and that'll be that. But I guess they must have seen something in me and some sort of passion where they thought, you know what, this guy could do this. And John Dent already knew of my work with his brother, so he kind of had a good idea that I was okay handling lots of gear and dealing with sound. But I had to, when I went into mastering, I had to be that tape op, and I had to be that kind of breathe down the necks of the 2 guys that were already doing sessions. And not only that, I had to learn how to cut records. I'd never come across a disc cutting lathe before, and all the complexities of how you do it properly, let alone do things like change a stylus and what do you do when you get, problems with the cut. So yeah, they kind of trained me, they took me under their wing. And as an engineer, you always know what you're kind of trying to do yourself. Nobody else can tell you what to do, if you like, in terms of sound. I don't think you can take tips and soak it all up, but you've got to carve out your own, your ears of telling you what to do, so they taught me a lot of stuff. I learned a lot of stuff. And then they dropped the bombshell and said, Mike, you're actually ready to do sessions now. And I'll never forget, my first attended session. It was actually with a French hip hop artist who didn't speak any English, with a super sub bassy mix that needed cutting to a 7-inch single. Like, not the easiest job on the planet. So, but yeah, and I was shaking, and as you do it's your first big gig, if you like. And then the sessions just kept coming. So, and over time you build up a client base, and when the way it works in this industry is if you've worked on a track or an artist, other people are very aware of that. Perhaps, well, more so back in the day because of album credits and things like that. So those credits on the back of a record would actually do you a massive favor as an engineer, because if you're into music and you're an engineer and you're a geek and you like to find out all the details, you read those sleeve notes, So that's basically how you go from one job to the next, and one artist speaks to another artist and goes, where'd you get your stuff mastered, And then they say, wherever, and then you get a call. Can you do ours too? So yeah, that's pretty much the story of my life. And thankfully, the CV is kind of increased and diversified. I've never got pigeonholed into any kind of specific genre of music, and worked on rock guitar stuff through dance music, house music, whatever when I first started at the Exchange in 87, the UK was going through this massive influx of new genres of music, which hasn't happened now for about the last 20 years. But, I was there on the birth of things like UK hip hop revival, acid house, house music, drum and bass. When that first came out, it was like, oh my God, you put somebody's master on, you had no idea what you were going to play. And then out come this new style of music. And you're like, whoa, okay, where are we going now? So it was really exciting times back then.
That's awesome. Well, so I'd love to go back to like before you got into the mastering studio and you were working as a recording engineer. Were you at least aware of the mastering step, or like, and what was somewhat involved in that? Or was it like completely new to you when you got into the mastering studio?
No, I did have an awareness, and that was basically because of my boss at the studio in Devon. His brother was running the cutting room at Island Records. So that was the connection. So we had quite a few jobs at the studio where a lot of artists wanted to put out vinyl. They weren't just doing it for a cassette or something. They wanted to put out vinyl. So 9 times out of 10, I got the job to drive the master tape up to London, go do the cut with John, which of course was a great day out for me and another eye opener into the whole process of what we do. So I was very comfortable with the kind of the feel of a mastering room, what goes on. And yeah, I had a real good heads up before I was called up to go help out, do some wiring and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I was just curious, like, how much, looking back at your career now, like how much of that experience in the recording world impacts the work that you do in mastering and vice versa?
Oh, it really helps because you just have this deeper knowledge of what you're listening to and what might have gone into the making of it. And I think for a lot of recording engineers, it would be really useful to step outside of their comfort zone and maybe go sit in on a mastering session just to see what an engineer is up against when they're given something to work on. It's very easy when you're in your own little environment, a home studio or a big studio or whatever, to just get very comfortable with what you're hearing on site. But in the outside world, is it actually any good? And sometimes, listening to your own stuff in another place is a good idea. So you get references, but also talking to another engineer about what they think about your mix. It's a hard one as a young mastering engineer, to be honest, because you don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. And, I guess nobody likes a yes man the whole time, because if the mix is crap, the artist would be better off knowing that. But sometimes you've got to dress it up a little bit, perhaps the way you break the news. But I tend to be much more blunt and, not rude or derogatory about what somebody's given me, but honest. And I think you get a lot of respect for that.
No, it's interesting. And, I often ask people who are mastering engineers, like, do you feel like it was necessary to learn the recording side of things before getting into mastering? Or do you think you could have just jumped right into mastering?
I'm glad that I had that recording experience before I jumped into mastering. I think perhaps it gives you that confidence, because it's a whole different thing when you're mixing and it's multi-channel. You're not just dealing with the stereo WAV. So you're a little bit more at mastering. You're a little bit more mindful of what's all come together to make that noise. At mastering, obviously you're restricted to a certain extent if you're working off of a stereo mix in a different way that you would be if you were calling up a mix session, because you've got individual control over all the elements. But I'm definitely glad that I had that background in the studio recording stuff before I went into mastering, because I just think it gives you a deeper feel for what you're doing at that mastering stage. Yes, I could have probably just jumped straight into mastering, but you would have almost been like a learner driver hitting the road for the first time without ever having sat behind the wheel. I know you learn as you go, but definitely the knowledge that I got at the recording studio was really helpful, because then you're also mindful of what you're listening to at mastering. Why is it sounding that way? Well, maybe the mics were set up crap, or maybe, there's too much thrown at the mix here, or stuff like that, so you get given what you're given to work on. You can't change that. Having that kind of deeper understanding of what they might have done to pull it together, is really good. And, you've probably heard this phrase countless times, a lot of the time with mix engineers, and the fact now that people are running sort of 96 channel sessions and all that kind of stuff, it can be madness. And one of the key comments I'll say to people if they just ask for advice is less is more. And I often use that analogy with hip hop. Listen to most hip hop tracks. There's probably less than 10 channels running, a drum loop, a bass line, a few keyboard plonks and the vocal. And it sounds as big and as energetic and exciting as you could possibly want, So,
that's true.
Yeah, less is more.
Of course. Yeah. And I think that I agree with you in the sense that like understanding the recording process, it does inform your decisions in mastering. And I think to go back to what you said earlier about like not being afraid to tell engineers like, hey, you do need to update your mix. I think that is important. If you understand that process, you can make those kind of notes. Yeah, the other side of it is that you get some mastering engineers who their approach to mastering is like, we preserve the original mix as much as we can, and we just slightly enhance it. And I think that that's all well and good, but you kind of need to start from a good mix to begin with to feel comfortable doing that, right?
Exactly. That the thing is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So a mastering engineer would never intentionally look at a mix and go, right, I'm just going to crank everything up and do my thing here. Because if it sounds good already, you don't need to do much. We get sent stuff from so many different setups now with so many more inexperienced engineers working on sound that you never know what you're going to get. But you have this kind of, you put a track on, right? And I guess within about 10 to 15 seconds, you instantly know what's good or bad about the sound you're listening to. Obviously, you got to listen to it a few more times just to get deeper into it. But you get this initial kind of, oh, wow, or, oh my God, it's like you get this feeling straight away the minute you put a mix on, and you're either going to be in for an easy ride, perhaps, or you're going to have your work cut out. And this is going to take some heavy EQ shifting and limiting and whatever you got to do. So I'll do as little as I possibly can if the mix has already nailed it. But if it's in need of a lot of help, you've got to get in there and do that, And I guess back in the day when I first started, I might have been a bit worried that I was doing too much sometimes. But you have to go with your gut feeling and get that energetic sound you want to achieve by getting in there and doing it. You can't pussyfoot about when you're mastering, because you could throw it back to the client and they'll go, yeah, it sounds okay, but... And then because you held yourself back and didn't go the whole way, you haven't hit the sweet spot, So mastering it's quite a risk as well, because, how do you know what the client is thinking about how their mix is going to sound if you do a lot? Have you done too much? Well, I just do that anyway. And then you throw it back to them. And if they don't like it, you have to do a recall. It's a bit like the same thing with the mixing scenario. Very rarely do I ever reject a mix or say this needs massive improvement. But if you do, those conversations happen more often now than they ever used to, because most times people can recall a session at a click of a mouse. Back in the day, you had to go back in and book that 48 track studio again, get the engineer back, do a remix, and it was an absolute nightmare. Now everything's so instant recall. Doing little mix revisions and little tweaks is actually quite easy. And I guess, similar with mastering, the difference with mastering a lot of the time, particularly when you run a hardcore outboard analog setup like mine, is everything's in real time. So, if you've got to recall a whole album, you've got to go through everything in real time. You can't just press a quick button and click it and go, there you go, how's that? And it's burnt out in, 90 seconds because of the analog chain part of it. And that's always been a big part of the way I work too, is the analog processing. It's definitely not all done in the box.
Yeah, just having those conversations with people and understanding like where they're at with their mix and how open to feedback they are. I think that has to happen in order to make sure that you're not overstepping your boundaries and that they also understand the expectations of what they should be getting on the back end too.
Yeah.
Right?
It always has to be a two-way thing. But again, as a mastering engineer, you really do have to not take control, but you've got to be fully confident in what you're hearing and what you're doing to convince the artist that you have done the right thing sometimes. Some artists will expect, you to do an awful lot if the mix isn't there already. So I just have this way of working where I can't listen to something where it doesn't sound like it's quite there yet. So if I've got to go a bit further than they might want, I've got to do that. I can't sit there and go, well, that was the mix you sent me. It's not that good. I've done a little bit to it. Why didn't you go even further than that and make it way better? So yeah, it is a risk as a mastering engineer. You've got nobody telling you what to do apart from perhaps a bit of email feedback or this is the sound we're going for. Sometimes it's handy. We get a lot of jobs now. They'll send a reference track, which is useful because when I get sent reference tracks, I always make sure that people are told, you must send me the volume you're expecting us to work at. If this reference track is exactly where your head's at, then I can work. I've got a template, if you like, to work towards. But if you send me a reference track that is not how you want your track to sound, don't send it. It's got to be sonically hitting your sweet spot. It's got to be the limiting and the volume's got to be exactly what you're looking for. Because if you send me that track, that's how I'm going to try and make your track sound. So that's really important. And it happens an awful lot more now. But in a way, that's not such a bad thing because it just gives you a heads up and an inside view of a client's mind as to what kind of, what sonics they're looking for in their mix.
Of course. Yeah, that brings up an interesting topic because something I find common with a lot of people is that when they're finding reference tracks, it's like they tend to pick songs that they really like, as opposed to songs that match the quality that they're looking for. And I see that a lot where it's like people will pick songs from like 10 or 15 years ago because nostalgically it's like it speaks to them, but they're trying to make something that sounds modern, and the modern sound is totally different than 10 or 15 years ago. So it's a really interesting balance of figuring out like, well, what do you want it to sound like? And if you're going for that retro sound, then that's awesome. If you're going for something modern, then you have to accept that is where we're going with this.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, you can't send somebody an Earth, Wind and Fire track and a Drake track and say, choose between those two. Well, make it something like that. Then the complete opposites. That actually really winds us up as engineers because you've got this like two-way street that you could go down, which is the right one, So that's why we always insist when reference tracks are sent, they are exactly what you're looking for tonally and volume-wise, Occasionally I'll get sent 2 or 3 tracks and very quickly one of those tracks will be completely different to the other two. So I'll just throw that out. It's like, well, that's a complete what you call red herring. That's unusable in the other 2 tracks you've sent me. So you have to kind of be a mind reader and a psychologist when you do this job as well. Yeah,
it's the one thing that they don't train you about in audio college, but it is such a big part of the job. Yeah,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So when you start a new project, what's your typical like mindset or approach to starting a new project? Like what kind of steps are you taking? What are you listening for? How do you take on that new project and start?
So let's say I was working on an album, for example. I'd pull up all the tracks and I'd have a touch through all the album tracks first before I'm making any sonic decisions about what I'm doing, just to figure out where tonally the album is at and where the differences are all at as well. Because obviously working on an album, you've got to pull that whole group of tracks together as a homogeneous sound. It's got to all work and be smooth. So I'll touch through an album and probably spend an hour or so just listening to the tracks and figuring out actually what I'm looking for is I'm looking for my starting point. So I'm looking for a track that I think captures all the right vibes. And then I'm making notes in my head saying, okay, that one's going to need a heck of a lot more work. Oh, hang on a second. The vocals are quite low on that track. So I'm going to have to try and do my best to pull that out a little bit with EQ as well, if I can. So yeah, it's a very kind of chilled out, cautious listen, if you like, the first time. But at the same time, you're making those sonic decisions where you know what's good and you know what's bad. In the case of just an individual track, then yeah, I'd put that up for 2 or 3 run-throughs without touching the EQs and then figure out what's good or what's bad about it. That's basically what we do. And then, on the 4th run-through, I'd start going, okay, you've already got a heads up of where you're going to go for sound-wise. So you start doing some stuff and playing with EQs and fairly quickly you tune in to what you need to do. And you've probably kind of nailed it within about an hour per track, something like that. So as I say, that first initial listen for a single track, you get that 10 seconds vibe of this is good, this is bad. With an album, it takes a little longer, obviously, because you're working with more material, and you have to figure out the differences between everything that's contained in that album. And, even sometimes when albums are recorded in the same place by the same engineer, there can be quite drastic differences. That's before you talk about the way albums are recorded now, where they're done in 10 different studios with 20 different producers in 10 different countries. So that throws up a whole heap of extra differences, if you like, which you don't want to hear when you put an album on and it's jerking around all over the place. Because if that happens with a mastered album, you haven't done your job properly.
Of course. So in the case of an album where you say you listen to the whole thing and you kind of find maybe what the best song is sonically, do you then start with that best song first and then kind of enhance that and then make everything else match towards that quality?
Yeah, absolutely. So often you're given a running order as well, obviously, to work with, but that's almost irrelevant to me. When I pull the tracks up, I don't really care what the running order's like initially, because, many a time I've started with the last track on the album, which some people are like, really? Why aren't you starting with the first track and working down the playlist? But for me at mastering, it doesn't work like that. You're trying to find that good sound to begin with. And even if you got to do work on it, you're then trying to pull all the other tracks together with that good sounding track. And you could be all over the place in the running order. If it was an album, what I tend to do is work on the, what I'd call the full on tracks. Like if it was a rock album, you're going for the, the full on guitar solos to the max, the loudest track on the album. And then if there are any ballads, those are the ones you do last, because you need to pitch the volume of a ballad or a mellow tune or a sound effectsy type thing. You can't start with one of those because you've got to pitch the volume of those, for the right level compared to the full on bangers. So that's kind of how it works. I start with the meaty ones, then work through the mid tempos and the down tempos, and then the ballads and sound effect stuff gets done last,
Yeah, for sure. Well, to piggyback on top of this question with, your approach to how you handle things, these days it seems to be more and more common that people are releasing singles. And one of the big gripes that I hear a lot of mastering engineers talk about is the idea of they'll have to master 3 or 4 different singles separately. And then the artist will eventually be like, let's throw it all together as an album. And now these songs sound different from each other and they're not as cohesive. So how do you approach those kind of situations?
Yeah, that does happen a lot now. The album it's not a dead format at all, but it's definitely not up there like it used to be back in the day. So yeah, you do work on a lot of individual singles. I would say if that client has used you for all of those 4 singles, there should be some coherence between them already. So the only difference is that if they did one single with you, one with another engineer, and the other 2 with other engineers, then you are going to get those differences. But I work really hard to bring cohesion to an artist's sound. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why clients keep coming back, because you keep delivering something they're happy with. So for me, it's really important to reference back to that single that you might have done a year ago. Well, pull it up and take a listen to it. Find out where you placed it and where did you pitch that volume? And because they were happy with that. So in theory, you should be using that as a bit of a template for where you're going with the new track. And then the next track after that, and that's happened with a lot of my clients over the years who've, they put out a single every 3 months and then 2 years later gone, okay, now we want to release 10 tracks as an album. And most times I could say, well, that's great. We've got all the mastered audio. I can pull them all together and they will work.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that I agree with what you're saying there. It's like just referencing back to your previous work it's kind of like the same process as what you described about working on an album when you have all the songs in front of you. You're just finding the best sounding song. And if the best sounding song in this case would be the previously mastered song. So it makes sense that
it's exactly that. Yeah, because you can't remember all your EQ settings and the sounds of a track that you did for an artist a year ago. But if you pull that up into the project and you bang it on again, you're right back there where you were a year ago, and you're able to continue the flow of what you should be giving them on their new track, Yeah, I find it really important to constantly reference back. It's not because you you're not sure what you're listening to or any of that. It's all about trying to deliver 100% what the client might expect. And you can only do that by reassuring yourself, listening to previous tracks you worked on by them to figure out where their head's at, especially say in the case where, you know, the fourth single they give you sounds completely different to some of the other stuff you worked on. The mix is poor, you know, it's really dull or it's really subby bassy and just not detailed enough. Then you know you're going to have to work hard on that tune compared to what you've been working on with them lately. And they might not have noticed that this new track sounds, you know, doesn't sound very good, but they'll soon notice it when you hand them back the mastered version, because they'll go, it doesn't sound as good as my previous tracks, does it? So constantly checking back, it gives you that workflow. It gives you that workflow to deliver what you want, hopefully first time.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we covered like your initial listen and how you approach starting a project there. But as far as like signal chain, then, you know, obviously every song is going to require different things, but do you have a typical way of organizing your signal chain and processing things?
Yeah, my signal chain hasn't really changed in the whole time. It's fairly minimal with solid silver cable connectors and all the geekery that goes into silver and XLRs and stuff like that. So it's not a multi-patch based situation, which personally I think can just sap the life out of, you know, an electronic signal. So it's pretty straightforward. So the bottom line nowadays is we're mostly all playing off of WAV files. You know, back in the day, I was using 1/2-inch tape machines, 1/4-inch tape machines. So you'd have to wheel the great big beast alongside you, connect up the XLRs and dangle the leads over the gear to get them into the inputs. You know, now we're pretty much running out of a DAW. So out of my sound card, it does go straight into a set of valve EQs. So that's kind of, it's still a very analog process, even though the source is digital. It'll go into a set of EQs, which then go into another set as well. I have a very small patch bay to insert things like de-essers, compressors, and stuff like that. And I will also use plugins on the DAW. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. I try to do the majority of what I'm doing in the analog domain, but sometimes analog is too vicious. If you want absolute pinpoint accuracy and subtlety, a digital EQ will get right to the crux of the matter without affecting too much either side of it. Analog is great because it gives you energy, it gives you dynamic, it gives you warmth, it gives you mid-range presence, it gives you detail. But sometimes if you're not careful, you can do too much because that's just the way it works. Even on a low bandwidth, that's analog EQ. My workflow is always into the analog chain, and then a combination of analog EQ and some digital EQ and some limiters and stuff like that as well. But you sometimes, again, you get an instinct when you put a mix up, you get an instinct as to whether you're going to have to go in hard with analog EQ and crank it up, or whether you're going to need to be gentle and use a bit of pinpoint digital EQ. You kind of have that sixth sense. It happens to me on every job. You'll put it on and you know, first of all, you know whether it's a good mix or a bad mix. And then you know what tools you're going to need to get in and do it. I guess it just comes from 40 years of listening to mixes pretty much. You only get that kind of, you only get that confidence from having heard so many mixes from so many places that, you know, you kind of almost feel like you now know what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, it makes sense, and I think it comes down to like really understanding your gear. And it's funny that you mentioned the E.A.R. EQs that you use, because you're the second engineer I've interviewed this week who uses E.A.R. gear. The first engineer I was talking with was Gavin Lurson, and he uses their 825 EQs, and I think you use the 822s, right, which are more of Pultec style. But he was saying that like the E.A.Rs, they do have a very distinct tone. They add a lot to it. So you do have to understand that when you're putting stuff through that gear, it is going to shape the sound. So I totally understand where you're coming from. As you know, when you need that clean sound, you can rely on digital for that. When you want the extra character and the warmth and everything that comes along with the gear, then, you know, by knowing what your equipment's gonna add, then you can lean into that when you need it.
The E.A.R. gear, yeah, it's reliable. It always manages to hit my sweet spot when I'm working, and there's never anything that I've not been able to do with them. I guess I've used them for a long time as well, so they're like my babies, and I've never been one of these engineers to get shitloads of equipment in on hire and do sonic tests on lots and lots of different EQs. I think that sometimes can get a bit confusing. Maybe it's me being a bit lazy, but I also know that, I know my baby's inside out. And yeah, of course they will add some kind of coloration. But I remember when we were doing listening tests with Tim. Tim came, he used to come and visit us at the exchange. Tim DeParavicini, this is. He used to visit us regularly because he also installed a bespoke disc cutting amplifier system for us there. So Tim great guy, totally crazy, mad professor, but absolutely hell bent on screwing the best out of anything he was building. And also the coloration thing, I think sometimes the choice of valves you use might actually also affect the way a tube EQ works, So we always used to kind of try and go for good quality valves for a start and just keep an eye out on when they might need replacing too, because a valve will age over time, as any guitar player will tell you with their amp. So you got to be mindful of that. But trust me, they've been my best friends actually my entire career, to be honest. So I've got the 822s, the 823s, which are the more mid-rangey ones. And I also use a pair of Tim's 660 limiters.
Cool. Yeah, it's awesome. Everything I've heard of the E.A.R gear, it just sounds incredible. And it does a thing. Like it does a thing. Adding a boost or whatever, it adds something that is really, really sweet. I mean, they're not cheap, but they do a thing that's amazing. Yeah.
That's it. They're not cheap. Yeah, that's right. But then I guess, a lot of gear like that, it's set at a level that isn't cheap. Yeah. I mean, Pultecs are another level beyond that as well and stuff, so it's kind of like heritage equipment. But the thing is, it sounds good, so why stop using it? Because it's old as well. I mean, in the UK, I don't know if you're aware of this. There's a equipment broker. They've just completely refurbished and rebuilt the Beatles Abbey Road recording console.
I have seen that. Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, they'll have recabled it and new components and stuff like that. But the basis of that thing will be the old school box that it was in. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If it's not letting you down, it's not humming and buzzing and distorting and all of that, then it's still good to go as far as I'm concerned.
Of course. So as far as going back to your signal chain then, so you said you run everything through the E.A.Rs first for the EQs. And then do you try to generally stick to just using EQ, or do you have like kind of compression usually in the chain, or is it just very program dependent?
Yeah, it really depends on the mix. I mean, obviously now we're working at crazy big levels from when I first started, where we used to have this thing called dynamic range. Now stuff is just smashed to the absolute limits. And I solely blame the MP3 and the streaming platforms for that. But that's a whole other argument. So a lot of the kind of hardcore limiting I will do in Logic, because they work in a completely different way to a set of analog valve limiters. However, there's often really good call for a bit of both. The valve limiters have this, even when you set them to work fast, they have this sluggishness, which can sometimes help, especially peaky vocals and big booming bass lines. They're really good for that, for controlling stuff that a plug-in limiter wouldn't get anywhere near it. Absolutely nowhere near it. So yeah, if I had a track that obviously you're working hot, so you've got to pump it up. But if I needed help with the analog limiter as well, I'd call on that for sure. And the same with the de-esser, even for digital work. I mean, the de-esser essentially was invented for disc cutting. I've got two in my chain that I can use. And many a time you'll get mixes where you've got vocals that are so sibilant, they're just going to tear anybody's heads off. So I will even use a de-esser when I'm working on stuff that's only going to be released for digital. When something's technically imperfect, deal with it.
Makes sense. I think that is the thing with mastering is, with audio engineering in general, it's like you don't have to do anything. You just have to fix the issues.
Exactly.
If it's an issue, if you like the imperfections, then it could stay. It all comes down to really like what ultimately sounds best to your ears, and then picking your course of action based on that.
Trust me, every mastering engineer never knowingly does anything by half. They're never going to sit back and go, I really can't be bothered today on this job, because, well, for me personally, I take every track really personally. It's like it's my track for the moment I'm working on it. And then you give it back to the artist. So I've got to be satisfied that it sounds good as if I made that bit of music. which is where the kind of the control freakism, I suppose, of being a mastering engineer comes in, because you can't sit back and listen to something that isn't done yet. So you get in there and you do it until you're happy, and then you just hope the client's happy too.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, you touched on the topic of loudness, and I was reading an article that was about your work with Oasis, and one of the things that struck me on there was that it said that one of the reasons why Oasis liked you, or why you stood out to them, was because you're kind of known for being able to get loud, clear masters. And I'm curious to dive into that a little bit. Like, when it comes to getting the clarity or getting that volume to work in tandem with that clarity, how much of that is reliant on the mix versus what goes into the mastering stage?
A bit of everything, really. You can engineer a sound to sound loud, even though it's, not peaking as high as maybe something else is that actually sounds quieter. I know that sounds really weird, but loud sound comes from the tone and the EQ of the mix itself. So if you've got a really boomy, dull mix, you could slam that, right up to the end stops, and it wouldn't sound as punchy as a track that's got loads of mid-range clarity, loads of presence in the top end and detail for a lower level. So what I've always tried to do throughout my work is to engineer a loud sound sonically with EQ. Then you look at the limiting side of it to push it even harder, So that's where the E.A.Rs have come in really handy. I mean, that Oasis out, all the stuff I did for Oasis was done through the E.A.Rs. In fact, it came in on 1/2-inch tape, probably about 40 reels of it. And that went through the entire E.A.R signal process. That, it's way before DAWs anyway. So total analog album, and the sound was achieved with Tim's EQs and his limiters, and driving the desk card. I was already up against it with that album because they had 2 albums out before that, and I asked Owen Morris, who produced the 2 albums, and then the one I was working on, and I said, who did the mastering? Because it's crazy loud, and they were. So I knew I was going to be up against it on that job. And he said, I did the mastering, Mike. I was like, really? And he goes, yeah, we just bounced it between 2 DAT machines or something through his desk at a high level. The thing is, it sounded good. So that, again, I was talking earlier about that referring back thing. When I knew I'd got that gig for the Be Here Now album, I pulled up Definitely Maybe and What's the Story, Morning Glory, and I wanted to hear where their heads were at sonically for that album, because I knew if it wasn't anywhere near that, goodbye to the job. So yeah, that's how it came about. And it was also through another client. I've worked with the Chemical Brothers in the UK, you're probably aware of, electronic dance music act, and we've been working since early 90s, 91, 92. It's crazy now. We've done 10 albums together. And anyway, long story short, Tom from the Chemical Brothers was friends with Noel Gallagher from Oasis. And Noel had said to Tom, where are you getting your stuff mastered? Tom dropped my name into the conversation. And I think that's how it came about. So, another classic case of you not needing to advertise for your work, your client's doing it for you.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, and it's funny to hear that connection of the Chemical Brothers and Oasis, because they are slightly different in sound from each other.
Oh,
which
completely.
Which kind of ties, which ties together to another question that I had earlier. You talked about having that diversity in your work, and you've worked with a lot of different artists in different genres, like U2, Prodigy, Etta James, Bob Marley, Oasis, NWA. Those are all so different from each other, and with all different genres, they all kind of have their own unique sound and requirements, I guess, or expectations, I guess, is maybe another way of putting it. People expect a certain sound out of certain genres. So I'm curious to know, when it comes to the mastering side, specifically as it relates to translation, do you find that your process tends to differ depending on different genres, or do you feel like it's more or less the same process?
Pretty much the same process. Yeah, I'm very aware if you're working on a, screaming guitar solo rock band, it's going to have a whole different vibe to a hip hop tune or, drum and bass or whatever, but you very quickly tune into what you've got to do to that mix to make it sound right. So, some of my days at work can be multi-genred. First thing in the morning, I might be working on a drum and bass tune. Then just after lunch, I might be working on a rock tune. Then I might be working on a hip hop tune. Then I'm working on a club track. So my whole day can go, across the board, mad tangents. But I love that because it keeps it fresh. And I'm so glad that I've not ever been pigeonholed into only one genre of music, because I love all kinds and it's a joy to work on all kinds. You just have to slip into that mindset of what kind of tunes you're working on. And to me, that it just it makes common sense, and it's not something I battle with ever. And even including if I'm doing the first hour a hip hop tune, the second hour a rock track, you switch mindsets and do it. And when you've got different genres of music, yes, you've got a sort of a template, if you like, in your head of what it might or what it should sound like, but you're still applying the same process to squeeze as much good detail out of that track and the mix as you possibly can, whatever genre it is, The only genre I've not done too much in is classical music.
And I'm sure even if you did classical music, you would still have your frame of reference of what a good classical record should sound like and work off of that.
Yeah, I think we'd probably be holding back on the big sub bass and, making sure it wasn't too shrill and all that kind of stuff. Classical music, a whole different level of engineering and skills, because, right there in an orchestra, you've got 10 bands playing at once. It's insane. I'm not a massive fan. My father was a big classical music fan, so I rebelled against it and went pop music. But now I so appreciate, the detail, the perfection of an orchestra, and my God, the noise they make. It, the hairs on the back of your neck stand right up. It's insane.
Yeah. You mean you're not going to make a timpani sound like the big sub drops of a hip hop track?
No, I'll leave that to Dr. Dre.
Fair enough. Well, another thing that I wanted to ask about as it relates to your mastering is mastering for vinyl, because I know you have a lot of experience in that. You have owned a lathe in the past, and you've gone through that whole production process of cutting to lacquer masters and using that for production. And I think that brings in a fresh perspective to mastering for vinyl versus a lot of the other mastering studios who are just creating just stereo files and sending it off to someone to hopefully take care of in the mastering stage or in the cutting stage properly. So I'm curious to ask about, like, when it comes to mastering for vinyl, what's your typical approach there, and what are some considerations that people should have as far as making sure that their masters sound clear when it actually gets cut at a production stage?
Mastering for vinyl, and it's how I started my career. It's a steep learning curve. Trust me, you can't cut good records until you've made a lot of mistakes for a few years, I guess. I think it took me probably about 4 or 5 years of cutting records to really feel like I was in control of the machine and telling it what to do, rather than it slap back in my face and go, oh, that sounds bad. So it's really a steep learning curve, and the bottom line of that is it's a physical medium that you've got to treat with respect. That moving wavy line, no bigger than a human hair, has to deal with so much crap you wouldn't believe it. It's incredible a record actually plays with a small stylus battering itself down what looks like a toboggan run. It's like a bobsleigh going down a toboggan run. That's what a stylus in a groove is like. So yeah, when you're cutting records, you have to be very mindful of a lot of technical things. And that's before the mix is either sounding good or bad. Cutting to vinyl, you've always got to be very careful about high frequency content. So we're talking about cymbal crashes. We're talking about sibilance on the S's and the F's of people's voices, bells that people use in recordings that are up around the 10, 12, 13K area. You've also got to be careful of super sub bass, because super sub bass takes up lots of groove movement. And if you've got too much bass on a fairly tightly packed set of grooves, then those grooves will crash into each other, and that results in a jumping record. So you've got to weigh up. First of all, the first question you ever ask yourself when you're cutting a record is, how long is the side? Because the length of a side on vinyl totally dictates how loud you cut that record at. The shorter the side, the more room you've got to throw everything at it. An LP, which might be 20, 25, 30 minutes aside, you're really trying to screw the best sound you can out of pretty much minimal room to do it in on a 30-minute side, So yeah, the bottom line is, the longer the record, the quieter it's going to sound. That's why the 12-inch single always blows away an album. But yeah, there's a lot of technical things you have to be mindful of. Also stuff like stereo width. That's a massive no-no for vinyl, because the vinyl cutting process automatically monos the signal to a small extent, because you're feeding a very definite left and right channel into a single groove. So that groove is containing the stereo information. And if there's a lot of difference between the left channel and the right channel, the cutter head starts bouncing up and down on the lacquer when it's cutting the groove. And if it bounces up too much, the groove disappears. So you then look at that under a microscope and go, oh, well, hang on, the groove's gone. Where is it? And that's because you've got too much stereo width information. So you have to be mindful of that and often introduce stuff like a spatial EQ just to remove some of the low frequency content that might be out of phase, that might be causing the cutter head to bounce. So there's a lot of limitations with vinyl, but at the same time, it still sounds so good. You know, you can, obviously you've got to you'd work on a mix in the exact same way as you would do as if you were mastering for digital. But you've also got to be mindful of all the imperfections of vinyl, the limitations of vinyl. You know, in the case of an album, for example, the first track on an album always going to sound clearer, brighter, more energetic than the track that's right up against the running groove in the label. You can't do anything about that. A lot of people don't understand that. They're like, why does the inner track, where's all the top end gone? All the hi-hats are disappearing, you know, which is why clever artists put a mellow track as the very last track on the album, which might not have too much going on because it will get away with what we call inner diameter distortion of a vinyl cut much better than it would do if you had a full-on crashing and banging drum kit with hi-hats and cymbals going and stuff like that. So that's always a good thing. If you're going to put a record out, put your mellow tunes at the end. And often that's what happened. And that became, you know, the A side had the mellow track. You flipped it over to the B side and bang, we hit the ground running with a big opener again. That was the whole vinyl experience, wasn't it? It was a journey, and that A side, B side stopping point almost gave you that time for reflection. You put the B side on and boom, off you went. So yeah, there's a lot of things you need to be mindful for vinyl. Having said that, if people are, you know, they're making a track for digital and then they go, oh, actually last minute, we want to put that out on vinyl now. You could either go back to square one and go back to their master and then engineer it for vinyl. Or if you've applied a decent kind of good sound to their digital master, you could back off your limiters a bit and then put that through your desk and treat it for the vinyl process. I'm still actually doing, even though I haven't got the lathe anymore, I'm still actually doing a lot of preparation for vinyl releases from digital masters, because this is a bit of a new thing that's been happening in the last kind of couple of years or more. A lot of pressing plants are buying up secondhand lathes. Now, there's not a lot of them in the world. And when they come up, they're like gold dust, you know, but a lot of pressing plants that are now actually really busy, rushed off their feet, running 24/7. They're also offering the in-house disc mastering service. I'm not going to diss any of those engineers, but I think a lot of the in-house factory engineers are literally they're just literally putting on the digital files and running them. They're not trained cutting engineers, but they can do the transfer process. Well, disc cutting is never just a transfer process. You've got to engineer the sound specifically for vinyl. And so, you know, I've still got a few clients, although I'm not providing lacquers anymore, I'm still working on their audio for vinyl cutting, because they can be confident that they're sending vinyl ready audio to a factory that literally is just going to put it on and run it. If you see what I mean, that's happening quite a lot now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, you know, there's definitely going to be that technical side of running a lathe and understanding that. And then there's going to be the technical side of understanding audio mastering and, you know, the sonics of it all. And to be able to be in your shoes and to know both is such a key. It's such a great combination. You need that if you're trying to get like the best sound quality, because you need someone who understands both sides of it. And I'm assuming that now that you don't have the lathe, like you at least have that knowledge of what goes into the process. So, you know, the work that you're doing on the audio side of it, it's all with that side of the technical lathe side of things in mind, I'm sure, right?
Absolutely. I mean, for all intents and purposes, you know, I still am cutting records, because when I'm doing mastering for vinyl, I'll never ever forget the training I had, you know, the 35 years of dropping the stylus on a lacquer and cutting a record and knowing what you've got to do to get it to work. That's in my DNA now. I'll probably still be remembering that when I'm in a retirement home somewhere. It's something that sticks with you the whole time. It's in your blood. And disc cutting, as I said, it was my upbringing into mastering. And there's no better way to learn about how to engineer a mix properly than to cut it to vinyl, because you've got to be mindful of so many more things than just does it sound any good or not.
For sure. Well, I think you did give some great tips there as far as like some of the basic things that you need to consider as far as like the low end, the stereo width, the sibilance, all that kind of stuff. I am curious to ask about the low end as it relates to stereo width. Do you find, like, I hear a lot of different mastering engineers differ on this topic, but do you personally feel like you need to mono that low end stuff beyond a certain frequency, or is that something that is kind of a myth?
I would only, yes is the easy, quick answer to that, but I would only do it to the point where if I was trying to cut that record, if I didn't do that and the record was jumping, then it's a failure. You can't put out a record that's technically going to cause everybody across the planet a problem and jump or skip or whatever. You've got so many things that you've got to be mindful of technically. And, bear in mind, not everybody's even A, got a turntable, B, got a decent one, or, not many people have got decent cartridges and playback systems. So you also have to be mindful of where's that record going to be played. And there's lines you can't cross when you cut a record. You're always pushing the boundaries, but there are technical restrictions that will stop you and make you have to make alterations to the sound of a mix, albeit very subtle. Everything we try and do, you try and do it without even noticing that you've done it. But yeah, I mean, the bottom line is if I was cutting a record and it was jumping because of an imperfection in the mix, I've got to sort that imperfection out. No question. There's no way any engineer is going to cut a record which has unvinyl friendly content to it and think they're going to get away with it. If they can, I'd like to see what they're doing.
But I do think that is what ultimately separates a professional mastering engineer from someone who's just casually dabbling in it. Like the casual dabblers, they know about the audio side of things and they try to make things sound great, whereas like the professionals understand the actual technical requirements of it and where the medium it's going to be printed and distributed on, and once like that really changes how you approach the audio side of things too. And so when you understand both sides, it definitely is going to improve the quality of everything overall. So,
well, most of the mastering engineers of my generation would also be good at handling a soldering iron. They'd also be good at getting an electronic test meter out and figuring out their equipment inside out. It's more than a level of being at one with your equipment than you'd ever imagine, and often as a mastering engineer, you're responsible for your own maintenance. You turn up in the morning, throw the big power switch and you just hope everything comes on. If it doesn't, well, maybe you've got a tech engineer who can help you out if you're in a big studio, or maybe you should have learned what goes into building that studio so that you can fix it yourself, and I've always been very hands-on like that from day one. And it just gives you this real confidence in your own equipment. When you know how it works inside out, as well as actually using it, you have this next level of kind of at oneness with your gear, and trust in it as well,
It's definitely a lost art, especially now with digital, where people just, you buy a plugin and that's what it is. And as long as your computer's up and running, it's fine. I mean, maybe that's the new technical side of things, is like being able to understand your computer very well. But at the same time, a lot of those analog modeled plugins and all that kind of stuff, like you're not going to understand the nuances that make one plugin sound different from another if you don't understand the physical makeup of this analog gear to begin with, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm sure with a lot of those copycat plugins, you can't screw them up like you can an analog. The rules with analog can be broken a lot of the time. And I'm sure that, I don't know, I've not really tried a lot of those kind of hybrid analog plugins because I'm still using outboard, but I'm guessing that there might even be limitations with a plugin that you buy that you can't do that same thing with the actual outboard bit of gear. Do you know what I mean? It's like, we're all about pushing boundaries and breaking rules as well. That's how you make records, isn't it?
Totally, yeah. I only can think of one plugin manufacturer off the top of my head, that Cornef Audio, who like on all of their plugins, there's a way that you can go inside the, like, actually, you can see like the PCB and like mess around with certain things and switch up resistors and stuff like that. And that it's fun. It definitely like gives you a whole new respect for the tools that way. But I only know of them that do it that way. But yeah, it definitely makes it a lot more fun to play around with stuff and to get a better understanding of, you know, what makes something work the way it does. So yeah, that's awesome. Well, I guess, you know, my last question for you is, at the end of the day, like, what in your mind ultimately makes a great mastered mix?
Oh, let me think about that one for a second. Because the opinion on that will change whoever you speak to and whichever artist you speak to. But for me, every engineer's got a sound. And I guess I've carved my career out. You mentioned earlier about, you know, creating this loud sound. I like stuff that has decent quality mid-range and top-end energy. That's the most important thing to me, is clarity and energy. And I've always strove for that detail. I almost think of the bottom end as the last part of what I'm trying to achieve. When I do a mix, I kind of, my first vision on it is where are we at with the mid-range? What's going on with the energy side of it? What's happening with the top end? And then obviously you jiggle it about as you go along. But for me, the ultimate mastered mix is a track that has really clear definition, good separation between the elements of all the components, although that's not something you can sort in mastering. If you're given a mess, then, you know, it's a mastered mess to finish with. But it's a track that has energy, clarity, depth, excitement in the sound. And I mean, the excitement comes from that connection with what you're hearing coming out the speakers, jumping out at you, and not being this kind of lackluster, dumpy, lifeless sounding boominess. It's got to be clear. It's got to crack, you know, that snare drum's got to crack. The hats have got to be clear, and the bass lines and all that. Of course, they need to be sat there. But I learned something very on as a young kid. In fact, Tim DeParavicini was even a part of this. I ran some Mission speakers as a teenager, and I blew the tweeters. So I guess I was about 16, 17 at the time. And I was aware of Tim. John Dent in London put me in touch with Tim because, funnily enough, he was right next door to the Mission factory. And he said, Tim can get you some new tweeters. So he did. And I put these new tweeters into my monitors, and all of a sudden the bass sounded better. And I was like, how is that even possible? I've just replaced the tweeters. But the correlation between the top end and the bottom end is closer than you think, because when you have that crisper, more clear and clarity in the top end, you get the detail in the bass as well, you know? So that was something I learned really early on. It sounds like it's complete madness, but trust me, it's true. So yeah, that's what I'm into when I'm listening to music, and what I expect when I hear other people's music is energy, clarity, and a connection to the sound, you know?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think to piggyback off of that, I think it all comes down to, when you're trying to create that energy, it's about understanding the frequency range. It's about understanding, you know, where you're going to find, first off, analyzing the track to identify what is the element of the mix that's going to provide that energy. And then once you identify that, it's knowing the frequency spectrum to know, okay, it's the snare that's giving me that thing, or the kick drum is giving me that thump that I want to dance to. So then you know where to focus your energy on frequency wise, and then you can EQ based on that to bring out those elements that, you know, are going to give it that energy and that feel. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
And, you know, with any genre of music and any kind of track, the backbone 9 times out of 10 is the drum kit and the bass line. And then everything else fits in around that. I mean, that even goes back to the old days when I was a recording engineer. You'd start off with the drum kit. That was the first thing you got sorted. You know, then you do the bass line, then you do the guitar parts, then you do the keyboard parts. And when you've got a mix that just hits the sweet spot with all those elements sat in clear definition, it's a joy. You know, that's what music should be. It should be, it's a proper sonic connection. It's not just a noise, you know, there's something deeper than that, you know. And yeah, I sometimes I listen to tracks at work and a tear comes to my eye or a lump in my throat, but just because of the emotional connection I get with the sound. Sounds weird, but it's like, whoa, you know.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. It's not always about just like the vocals and like the lyrics. The music is going to provide all that feel too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Mike, I think this is a perfect spot to start to wrap up. If people want to learn more about you or maybe even follow you online or maybe even work with you, like what's the best way for them to do that?
So we're still running the website, www.mikemarshmastering.co.uk. That's got all the email and the contact details on there. We run the socials, but kind of don't get too involved in a lot of back and forth on there. Otherwise, I'd be there all day. And I'm into making music, not talking about it too much. The website probably is the best way. And then via the emails. And yeah, if you're keen to work, we can slot you into the diary and it'd be good to do it. So I've got clients literally all over the globe, as probably most people do now. Back in the day, it was just London. Now, it's the US, it's Australia, it's Japan, it's Canada, it's the whole of Europe, which is really exciting because I'm working on music from all over the world. And a lot of the time I'm working on music I don't even understand what they're singing about because it's in a foreign language. So
That's
great.
Amazing. That's awesome. I love that. Well, I'll definitely include links in the show notes too, so people can click on that and find you easier too. So, cool. Mike, again, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. It's been great learning more about your process and your way of approaching mastering. And I definitely think people are going to find this episode very helpful and learn a lot from it. So thank you again.
Let's hope so. You're welcome, man.
So that was my interview with Mike Marsh, and I enjoyed learning more about his process, especially as it relates to his strategy behind coming up with a game plan for mastering and how he, in that early stage of working on a new project, is just critically listening and mapping out his game plan of, what are the differences between different songs? What is the best song? And then listening to reference tracks or referencing other songs within an album. I think all of that stuff is really cool and really helpful and something you can certainly implement into your process too if you're mastering your own records or if you're mixing your own records, just getting into the concept of referencing other material out there so you have a sense of what to be shooting for. What should you be listening for as far as volume balances between your tracks or frequency balances between the low end and the mid-range and the top end. All that stuff's really important. And ultimately, like Mike talked about in this episode here, the way the different frequencies interact with each other. He shared that example of how he got a new tweeter on his speakers and how that changed the way he was analyzing the differences between the top end versus the low end and how they're related to each other. So, I think that's all really important stuff to consider. And reference tracks are going to help you get there faster. When you understand your speakers better, then you know where to go with your tracks, right? So I thought that was really helpful to get into as well. And I also really enjoyed learning a little bit more about some of his gear and his process behind, using his E.A.R. EQs. If you haven't checked them out, definitely go check them out on YouTube. They sound incredible. I got to admit, I've seen pictures of E.A.R. EQs and compressors in studios before, but I never really knew what they were. And it's only recently that I started looking into them. And they're definitely a bit of unobtainium. They're super expensive, but when you watch some videos showing before and afters of using the EQs, man, they sound incredible. So definitely something that you can check into for fun and get a sense of, how a tool like that can change your sound. And even if you're not using a big expensive piece of equipment like the E.A.R. EQs, I think the point still sticks true that you have to understand the gear that you're working with, whether it's a plugin or whether it is hardware. When you understand your gear really well, you can lean into the sound of a specific piece of gear for specific uses, So yeah, just something fun to consider with your own mixes and understanding your own tools as well. Now, speaking of understanding your own tools, if you're working on your tracks and you're having trouble understanding how to use your tools properly to get the sound that you hear in your head to come out of your speakers, if you're constantly making tracks that only ever feel like demo quality and they're just not really standing up against your favorite recordings, well, that's something I'd definitely love to help you out with. And inside of my coaching program, Amplitude, that's exactly what I work on with my students. I work one-on-one with them to help come up with your game plan of what you want your music to sound like, and then we reverse engineer the process so that you know exactly what to do during the recording, editing, and mixing stage to ultimately get there. And as you're working on your tracks, you're getting personalized one-on-one feedback all along the way, one-on-one guidance. I'm there to show you exactly what to do. And we're hopping on calls and we're working on your tracks together so that you're ultimately getting the sound that you want. You end up with a process that's repeatable and that gives you more confidence in what you're doing so that you can do it over and over again at the highest quality. So if you're interested in learning more about that program, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/amplitude, and you can find out more on there. And on that website, there's a link where you can apply for the program and hop on a call with me. I'd love to learn more about you, your goals, your processes, what's working for you, what's not working for you, and ultimately to see how I can truly help you and if I can help you. I only work with people in this program who I truly believe I can help. There are some people who aren't a good fit, whether it's based on the genre of music that they're working on, that I feel like there might be better people suited for that genre, or maybe there's specific problems that I know I can't help you with. So that's why I like to hop on these calls with people to see if I can truly help. And if it seems like I can help, then I would love to invite you into the program. Again, I'm not here to sell you something you don't need. I only want to work with you if I can help you. I want you to see the benefit of it, because at the end of the day, my reputation relies on me doing a good job for you. So that's why if it seems like I can help, we can talk about the program. And if it doesn't, we go on our own ways. So yeah, if that sounds like something you're interested in, make sure to check out MasterYourMix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details there. And then with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around. Can't wait to chat with you in the next one. I'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit MasterYourMix.com.